That's right, yeah, right. To bring together this excellence Let's sit down. in the context
steps are taken to make the necessary changes happen at farm level. In my remaining few minutes, I will say just a few words about the protection of wildlife under EU legislation. So the next slide, please. We presently have an eclectic bunch of statutes that provide a degree of protection to wild species and their habitats. First, for wild animals in trade, there are the wildlife trade regulations, which transpose the provisions of CITES into EU law and lay down the overall provisions for the import, export, and re-export, as well as the internal EU trade in specimens of species. The wildlife trade regulations are, however, far from perfect. For example, as Manuela alluded to, there is a gaping loophole that allows the continuation of trade in nationally protected species, which have been taken illegally from their country of origin, to be legally traded in the EU. This legislative gap should be of particular concern to Australia, which has comprehensive protections for all of its native species. We are pushing for trade in non-listed CITES species that have been taken in violation of the laws of other countries to be criminalized here in the EU. And we're really hoping that the Commission is going to act on this. At least it's in the Wildlife Trafficking Action Plan that they're looking into the feasibility of this. Next, we also have the EU Nature Directives, which are some of the oldest pieces of legislation in the EU. The overall objective of the Habitats Directive, which is designed to protect over 1,000 species, is to ensure that these species and habitat types are maintained or restored to a favorable conservation status within the EU. Yet this legislation is constantly under threat from those who wish to reopen them, to reduce protections for species such as wolves and bears. Thus far, the Commission has refused to bow to such demands, but there is a continued risk that it may one day happen. In addition to this legislation, we also have the Zoo Directive and a ban on wild bird imports. The latter came about as a result of public health measures to deal with avian influenza over a decade ago. We also have legislation concerning invasive alien species, a ban on the trade in commercial seal products, a ban on the use of leg-hold traps, and the sale of pelts acquired using this cruel method. Legislation stipulating that all sharks in the EU vessels, landed by EU vessels, should still have their fins naturally attached, and a regulation on technical conservation measures for fisheries, which, amongst other things, deals with issues like preventing cetacean bycatch. Can I have the final slide now? Thank you. Oh, okay. Sorry, this was the overview slide. Can I have the next slide? Right, okay. There's still a huge amount of work to do in the European Union to protect wild animals and their habitats. Back in 2020, as part of the flagship European Green Deal, the Commission adopted its biodiversity strategy, which made many commitments to protect nature, reverse the degradation of ecosystems, and put Europe's biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. This also included commitments to protecting and halting biodiversity loss, which is especially relevant in this context of this trade deal. Because in the strategy, the EU has committed to the full implementation and enforcement of biodiversity provisions in all trade agreements. As promised, they've also now delivered a revised EU action plan against wildlife trafficking, tightened the rules on EU ivory trade, and delivered a proposal to revise the Environmental Crime Directive, something which is now reaching its final stages of negotiations between the institutions. These are just a few of the actions that are needed to protect wildlife, both in the Union and elsewhere around the globe. I'm going to stop here because I'm probably well over time, but I hope that I've set the scene in the context of the roundtable discussion that shortly take place. And for those of you that were without sound, I have your email addresses, so we'll make sure that you at least get the text of this presentation. It's working now, but the bits that you missed, that you have the text of that presentation later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jo, and for this good overview on animal welfare legislation that we have currently in Europe and what is to be expected. And I couldn't agree more with you that animal welfare in Europe leaves a lot to be desired. And that is why we are looking forward to autumn, where the Commission hopefully will present their animal welfare legislation package. Even if I have to say it's too late to conclude it in this legislation, but at least this is something we can work on and then will be transported into the next legislation of the European Parliament and the new Commission. So now our next speaker is Nicola Bainon from Human Society International Australia. And Nicola has more than 25 years of experience campaigning in the Australian and international animal protection movement. She first joined HSI Australia in 1989 and now works as the head of campaign overseeing the office advocacy to achieve their mission for a humane and ecological sustainable world for animals. There are currently a number of animal welfare and environmental law reform processes underway in Australia to keep her busy, and she also works on international wildlife protection treaties. Among their career highlights was taking Japanese whalers to court and winning. Congratulations for this. In order to be here, Nicola has stepped away from a meeting in Edinburgh where governments are gathering to save albatross and we say petrels. Thank you very much for that. And we're very happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone in the room, and hello to people online, and good evening, good day to everyone back home in Australia. I'm really thrilled that I could be here in Brussels to deliver this presentation in person. If I could have the first slide, please. So my name is Nicola Bainon. I'm the head of campaigns for Humane Society International Australia. And my presentation here today is going to talk about the frameworks for animal protection in Australia, both animal welfare and wildlife protection through our environment laws. So the first slide is starting with the basics. Australia has a federal system of government. So we have our Australian federal government who are doing the negotiations with the EU on the free trade agreement. And then we also have 8 state and territory governments. And so protecting animals in Australia is a shared responsibility between those different tiers of government, which can get quite complicated. The next slide, please. So to break it down a little, the federal government, for talking about animal welfare first, the federal government deals mainly with imports and exports. So our federal government is particularly focused on export of live animals from Australia, sheep to the Middle East and cattle to Southeast Asia. Hopefully the sheep to the Middle East will shortly be finishing, but that's been the focus of the federal government. Our states and territories, they look after the prevention of cruelty to animal laws, the POCTA legislations, which are currently being largely reformed and becoming more animal welfare laws governing not just prevention of cruelty, but also dealing with providing good lives to animals and dealing with husbandry and slaughter issues. We also, at the state and territory level, that's where our companion animals are taken care of, and also regulations governing exhibited animals and animals in research. The next slide, please. So how well are farm animals protected in Australia? Focusing on farm animals, cruelty to farm animals is exempt from those state prevention of cruelty to animal laws if it's compliant with codes of practice or standards and guidelines. Those standards and guidelines are negotiated nationally, and unfortunately, it's a slow and ad hoc process to negotiate those standards. And there's been, over the last 10 years, a distinct lack of federal leadership in those processes. Essentially, it's up to each jurisdiction to then implement into their own laws what's been agreed nationally. And that can take time, and it doesn't happen automatically. So what you can end up with is a patchwork of standards and guidelines across the country rather than uniform standards for the whole country. The other problem is that the negotiation of those standards and guidelines is very much dependent on one state or territory to stick their hand up and initiate a new standard review process. Often that's initiated because there's been an expose of really poor practices. It hits the news, and the state or territory where that scandal has occurred says, right, it's time to do something about these standards and guidelines. What I'm trying to convey is that there's not a systematic process where our standards and guidelines are regularly being reviewed, say, every 3 years or every 5 years. It's much more reactive and not an ideal situation. And this is where we're hoping that the federal government, we have a new federal government who have accepted that there is a role for them in the animal welfare policy space. And we're hoping that they will improve that system for setting standards and guidelines in Australia. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of the standards and guidelines. So they're set on an industry sector basis. I won't go through all of them, but just to give you a sense of why we get so frustrated with this process. The poultry standards at the top of that list, they took nearly 8 years to negotiate. They were finally agreed last year. And even when agreed, they still do not plan to phase out battery cages, barren battery cages, until 2032 to 2036. So we've still got another 13 or so years of battery cages in Australia under our most recently negotiated standards. Next slide, please. Yes, no, can we go backwards? I think you've gone forwards a couple of slides. So I should have given you a warning before we came to this slide, because it's not a very pleasant image. The reason we're so frustrated with our standards and guidelines is that they still allow a significant number of cruel practices to occur. And if you remember, I explained a little moment ago, our producers are exempt from animal cruelty if they're compliant with standards and guidelines. So it is very upsetting that these cruel practices are being enshrined in the standards and still permitted. So examples of practices that are allowed to continue surgical mulesing of lambs without pain relief. And the photograph is a lamb who's recently undergone that procedure. So you can see how it's pretty horrific that that could take place without pain relief. Tail docking of lambs without pain relief. Dehorning of cattle under 6 months of age without pain relief. Castration of cattle under 6 months of age without pain relief or anaesthetic. Hot iron branding of cattle without pain relief. And the electroimmobilization of cattle over 6 months in certain of our jurisdictions. Next slide, please. It goes on. Provision of shade for beef cattle is not mandatory in feedlots. Maceration or carbon dioxide gassing of unwanted male chicks in the egg industry. As I said before, barren battery cages will still be allowed until 2032, 2036. Debeaking of layer hens. Up to 48 hours without water for cattle and goats over 6 months and for sheep over 4 months. And up to 24 hours off water for adult pigs. That gives you a taste of why we say, and in the EU, stakeholders are rightly concerned that our standards are lower than they are in Australia. I'm going to focus on wool because it is a significant export from Australia, and that issue of mulesing. So 10 million lambs a year undergo mulesing in Australia, and pain relief is not mandatory for the procedure. There you can see the procedure taking place in the image. Only the state of Victoria mandates pain relief for this practice. Now, the practice is done to prevent fly strike, and we are in no way saying that fly strike should be allowed to occur to our poor sheep. It's a horrific condition, and it can cause a lot of pain and be fatal. But there is an alternative solution. Merino sheep for wool can be bred to be resistant to fly strike. Through genetic selection, you can breed sheep that are smooth-bodied, that do not have the wrinkles that attracts the flies. And you can see there's one of each kind of sheep, a sheep with wrinkles and a plain-bodied sheep, that just simply doesn't suffer from fly strike. And many producers in Australia are now breeding smooth-bodied sheep that are resistant to fly strike and do not need to be mulesed. So if we have one of our hopes for this agreement is that Australia could be encouraged to put practices like this in the past, given that there are viable alternatives that are a win-win solution for producers as well as for sheep. The next slide, please. Another significant export from Australia is our beef. And here we have a series of welfare issues detailed on the slide: lack of shelter in feedlots, lack of shade, heat stress, and painful procedures that are allowed to continue without pain relief, dehorning, disbudding, castration, hot iron branding, and spaying. We also have a number of environmental issues involved with our beef industry, which I'll come to in a few slides. And that's probably the segue now to move to how Australia protects its wildlife. Again, we have got the federal system, so protecting wildlife in Australia is split between the federal government and our states and territories. The federal government, the national piece of legislation is called the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which passed through the Parliament in 1999. And so that deals with matters of national environmental significance, which includes our nationally threatened species, World Heritage Sites, our internationally listed migratory species, internationally listed wetlands, national heritage sites, and nuclear issues. The legislation is over 20 years old and it's currently undergoing reform. And then our states and territories have their various environmental protection laws that deal with planning and species conservation as well. Next slide, please. So how well are the laws protecting wildlife in Australia? Well, Australia ranks #1 in the world for mammal extinctions. We're number 5 in the world for deforestation rates, and we're the only developed nation in the top 10. In 2019-2020, figures show that 85% of all clearing that was done in Queensland was to create new pasture for the cattle industry for beef. And so it's no wonder, given our deforestation rates, that we have more than 1,800 species of Australian plants and animals that are threatened with extinction. So clearly our legislation is not doing the job that it's supposed to do. Next slide, please. But will this get better? Well, the federal government, we've had a change of government, and there have been some new policy settings which are encouraging. So the Australian government has committed to 30 by 30 by 30, which is 30% of the marine environment, 30% of the terrestrial environment to be in protected areas by 2030. The government has also committed to no new human-induced extinctions, which is a fantastic commitment. And with those 1,800 species on the threatened with extinction lists, that is an ambitious commitment. And it will be achieved by reforming the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which needs to be significantly strengthened. So those reforms are currently being discussed with stakeholders and will still need to pass the Parliament. The government's also committed to create an independent environment protection agency, which will be a much better way of environmental decision making and governance, taking some of the politics out of those decisions. The big question, of course, is though the funding that's going to be provided to turn around our extinction crisis. Scientists have estimated that we need at least $2 billion a year to be put into turning around the crisis, and we've not seen anywhere near that level of funding in our most recent federal budget. Next slide, please. Our wildlife in Australia also suffers from licensed persecution. So Australia, I think, is famously home to the largest slaughter of terrestrial wildlife for our commercial kangaroo industry. 1.18 million kangaroos were permitted to be killed in the commercial industry in 2020, and that was 1.3 million in 2021, and that excludes the state of Tasmania. In addition to the commercial killing, wildlife in Australia is allowed to be killed if it's deemed to be a pest species and inconvenient for producers. We're at Humane Society International Australia just doing some research through freedom of information requests to find out exactly how many licenses are being killed for our native wildlife in each of the different jurisdictions. And so far, we're from the 2021 figures, which are the most recent figures, we're up to 900,000 individual animals licensed to kill. So that's kangaroos, birds, wombats, and also dingoes can be killed without a license. And so it's very difficult to get a handle on those figures. And it is the cattle, lamb and wool industries that are driving a lot of that licensed killing. Dingoes because of the predation on livestock, and kangaroos because of grazing competition. So I think it's important to be aware of what's going on at the end of the supply chains for some of these imports into the EU. Next slide, please. Marine animals, how well does Australia protect marine animals? I would say that our fisheries are relatively well managed. That's not to say that they don't have problems, but when problems arise with bycatch of protected species and overfishing, there are relatively good frameworks for addressing that. Perhaps one of the most shocking problems that we have persisting in Australia in the marine environment are culling programs for our shark species, including threatened shark species. And the states of Queensland and New South Wales still have culling programs, and they're exempt under our federal laws, our current federal laws, but we hope that the reforms might change that. And they include culling that impacts threatened species, and it also takes place in the Great Barrier Reef, which is a World Heritage Site, of course. And the statistics in those culling programs, which are mostly not actually killing the sharks that are a potential problem for humans, they're culling a lot of other wildlife. And in the New South Wales program last summer, one marine turtle was entangled every 6 days. And of course, there are alternatives, as there always are. Culling the scientists, no scientist will stand up in court and tell you that culling sharks is effective at minimizing the risk to human safety. I know because I've been in court on this issue, and the scientists ran a mile. Culling's not effective, whereas we have technology now which can keep swimmers safe at the beaches, including European tourists. We've got drone surveillance, and we have alert systems that can warn us when there is potential risk in the ocean. There's no need for these programs. Next slide, please. Because I've just been in Edinburgh working on albatross, I had to do a slide on albatross. But one of the things that we're really hoping to see from this free trade agreement is lifted ambition from both sides to implement the multilateral environment agreements that we are party to. And one of those agreements would be the agreement for the conservation of albatross and petrels. And they certainly need greater cooperation from countries. 15 of 22 species are at risk of extinction. And it's longline and trawl fisheries that are killing them. And the estimates are over 100,000 a year. The agreement has come up with advice for fishers for techniques that they can use in their fishing operations that avoids this bycatch. And it's just a case of being able to persuade fisheries to adopt those techniques. So Australia, France and Spain are ACAP members. And importantly, the EU is a significant member of the regional fisheries management organisations, which ACAP, the agreement, is trying to influence. So we would love to see the agreement specifically mention, the free trade agreement specifically mention the albatross agreement as one of the MEAs that parties can commit to better implementing. Thank you. Next slide, please. So that concludes the presentation. I guess overall my concluding remarks are that we do look forward to the FTA lifting ambitions for animal protection across the board in both Australia and Europe, and globally through greater cooperation at those multilateral forums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for this very good presentation, for setting the scene about the current state affairs in Australia, and for all the fight that you do for animal welfare protection. Thank you very much for this. As I said before to the European Commission, we have also a new EU-New Zealand free trade agreement that was concluded, which contains good language on animal welfare. It is, of course, not perfect and it needs to improve, but the EU-Australia agreement should definitely not go beneath it. And I mean, in this New Zealand free trade agreement, we have enforceability at least of some TSD provisions that me and my group were fighting very much for. And the EU-Australia free trade agreement could even be better than the EU-New Zealand free trade agreement if we get chapters on sustainable food system and on animal welfare that are subject to the dispute settlement mechanism. So let's go into this direction. Before I pass over to Joe, please help also yourself to the breakfast, because it would be really a pity to waste food here. And Joe will be moderating the rest of this panel discussion. And I already have to apologize now that I have to leave a few minutes before 10 because I have to vote in the committee. This is something that we have to do, and that's why I have to leave a little bit earlier. But I'm very much looking forward now to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela. So we're now going to move on to the panel part of this meeting. For this, we're going to be joined by a number of additional speakers representing the negotiating teams from both sides, as well as representatives of two other NGOs. Let me first start online, and if I can just ask our Australian participants in the panel online, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the technology isn't going to fail us again, to unmute themselves and to put themselves on camera. So let me first start by welcoming Emily Follett, who's the Assistant Secretary for the Agriculture and Non-Tariff Barriers Branch of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She is originally a solicitor, and she's been working primarily for the Australian government for the past 2 decades. She leads Australia's engagement at the WTO, and she will be joining us online, hopefully from Canberra. Emily, if you could get yourself off camera, if we can. I'm hoping this is going to work. Let me also just introduce Joanna Granger, her colleague as well, who is Minister Councillor for Agriculture, representing the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry at the Australian Mission to the EU in Brussels, Belgium. Jo has 18 years public service experience in policy regulation and programme management in a variety of fields, including trade and agriculture, as well as having worked on a range of agricultural commodities. Both Jo and Emily, is it possible to unmute and get them on video, please? Okay, maybe if we can remove the slide, stop the slideshow.
I'm now unmuted. It's Emily Follett here. I'm not sure if you can hear
hi,
me.
Emily. Great. Okay, then we can keep that that slide. Great. Thank you. Right, and yeah, I guess Jo will, if she needs to speak, she can join us in there. Okay. Yeah, sorry about the gremlins on this thing. Okay, we're also joined today by several representatives from the European Commission. Firstly, from DG Trade, we have Flavia Bernardini, who is also working. I'm just thinking which is, yeah, okay. And then her two colleagues from DG Sante, also working on trade issues. There's Anna Maria Popper and Nicholas Goods, who will be fielding questions on animal welfare since this falls under their remit. Unfortunately, because of the state of the negotiations right now with Australia, the colleagues dealing with sustainable development weren't actually able to join us today. So we're going to be restricted from the Commission side to only responding on the animal welfare issues. Our government representatives will be joined by two more panelists. Let me first welcome, a very warm welcome to Jed Goodfellow, who is the Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Australian Alliance for Animals. This is a new charity which is leading the strategic alliance of Australia's key animal protection organisations. Jed has over 20 years' experience in animal welfare law, policy and advocacy. He has a PhD in animal welfare law, and he also teaches in Macquarie, if I'm pronouncing that right, University, where he also teaches animal law. It is our very good fortune that he also happened to be in Europe at the moment. So he hopped on the Eurostar and could join us here in person. So yeah, complete coincidence that both our Australian guests were in this part of the world. And last but by very means not least, let me welcome Stephanie Gislin, who is the Political Affairs Manager for Eurogroup for Animals. Before taking up this position, she led their trade and animal welfare program for almost 6 years and was their representative on the Commission's expert group on trade negotiations, also participating in various EU domestic advisory groups, DAGs, as they're called, which I think our Australian colleagues here are going to find very funny, such as the ones created under the trade agreements with Ukraine, Canada, Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore. So with all of those rather lengthy introductions out of the way, let us now get down to business. From the presentation so far, it's clear that there are some pretty significant differences between the EU and Australia when it comes to animal protection. And these differences are probably only going to increase even further, particularly with regard to farm animals if and when the EU does upgrade its farm animal welfare legislation. Let me see. So for our guests from the Commission, I don't know, Anna Maria or Nicholas, which one of you would like to answer this question, but it's now pretty standard for the EU to propose the inclusion of animal welfare in its trade agreements. Could you tell us from the negotiations, which I know the SPS and the Sustainable Food chapter are kind of preliminarily closed, concluded, could you tell us about what kind of ambitions the EU has for farm animal welfare in the trade deal with Australia? And have these ambitions actually changed following the adoption of the farm to fork strategy, given negotiations actually started under the previous incarnation of the European Commission? I don't know which one of you would like to take the floor for this.
Thank you. Here's Nicholas Good. So I take the honor to respond to that question as best as I can. As already said, animal welfare is managed by different DGs, and I can only take position from the DG Sante competence. And I think the first statement is very clear that we work basically in all our agreements only on cooperation. So DG Sante does not have, let's say, restricting measures in relation in the trade agreements, and this is trying on the level of cooperation to improve the standards on both sides of the partner agreement countries. Of course, we have our EU import legislation with its requirements, but that's a separate process. I think this has to be distinguished, and it is not the intention for DG Sante now to change this kind of approach. And I think this was also clearly said from the very beginning when we started the negotiation, that animal welfare is a cooperation chapter with Australia, which was also a basis of establishing this article on animal welfare. It was decided to put the animal welfare article in the SFS, in the Sustainable Food Systems chapter. That's what I can say. I mean, I cannot say anything yet because it's not yet concluded, but maybe that is possible that I can say. So which gives then also the forum and the framework for future cooperation. To mention that there is already cooperation, even a kind of an arrangement under the Animal Welfare Forum, which is established between DG Sante and Australia's, I think, Department of Agriculture since 2007 and 2008, where there is already cooperation, and there was the last meeting in November last year, and this is a very fruitful cooperation, which basically really helps each other's side to get also examples how animal welfare is done on both sides. And there are also areas where Australia is actually more advanced in the EU, where the EU has inspiration also for eventual future legislation in the EU. So to put that into context. So I don't know whether you would need more on this level. I mean, other DGs in the Commission may have some other competence to do this, but I cannot speak on that behalf. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas. Let me do, I think Flavia wants to add something to that.
Flavia Bernardini, DigiTrade. Just wanted to compliment on my colleague, and I've got so many inputs from your side in the last hour that have a lot on my mind. So thank you for that. And a little word as a start to excuse the chief negotiator that is not there because he's traveling. So Christoph Kiener really wanted to be there but couldn't. And back to business, as you said, one important thing that was said by you and by Mrs. Riba too, is that there was an evolution in these 5 years. There was an evolution since the start. And I think that in these last 5-6 years, I've seen animal welfare being integrated much more in policy in general, but in DigiTrade in particular, in trade policy. And this is, in my view, also thanks to the awareness raising that has been done at the European Parliament and by the civil society, both directly and through the MEPs that are in the room. I think that you had a big role in that, and I think that you should be proud of how this has evolved in trade agreements. And that's a very important point that I want to underline. Human society said it is important to be aware. Indeed, it is important to be aware. I learned myself things today, but I think that by every presentation, we learn from each other a lot, and that's a merit of this house to channel this. And also in terms of one other thing that I wanted to say that I think it's important is that in terms of cooperation on standards integrated into trade agreement, we have as a fundamental reference international standards. So we are not trying to transmit we're not trying to explain to the others what to do, but we have international standards as reference, and that is a line that we have in the entire trade agreement, and therefore also in animal standard. That's it. Thank you for that.
Okay, many thanks for the addition, Javier. I'm now going to turn to Emily in Australia. I understand that the inclusion of animal protection issues in trade agreements is a relatively new thing for the Australian side. So far, it's been limited to provisions in a few agreements on animal testing in cosmetics. And the animal welfare chapter in the recent EU Australia UK free trade agreement, which I believe comes into force this month, as well as having language relating to biodiversity protection and wildlife trade. Does the Australian government think that it's a good idea to include the kind of provisions on animal welfare that the EU has been proposing for this trade deal? How did you respond to the original text proposals?
Well, thanks very much for the question and also for the invitation to join you all today. I, like my EU colleagues, will pass on apologies from our Chief Negotiator, Alison Burrows, who is indeed in close discussions with her EU counterpart as we speak, I think. So unfortunately, she was not able to join you, and it's a privilege and an honour to be standing in her stead for today's discussion. I just say at the outset, and I think it picks up on perhaps your earlier question as well, that Australia and the EU really do share common and ambitious goals with respect to animal welfare and sustainability more broadly. That said, our climate and production conditions means that we have very different methods of achieving this. But notwithstanding these different methods, the approach we are taking and we hold to be true is that we, like the EU, have high standards of animal welfare, and that's certainly something recognised by the World Organization for Animal Health. I think in 2015 it carried out an independent assessment of veterinary services in Australia and awarded Australia the highest level of competency for animal welfare criteria, putting Australia in just a handful of countries awarded this level of competency. Obviously, our approaches can look very different, to the approaches taken in the EU. And that's one of the reasons that having this kind of cooperation mechanism in the FTA, building on the existing bilateral cooperation in this area that my dear colleague and counterpart Nicholas Gut just referred to, building on that existing cooperation, we're looking forward to continuing that under the umbrella of the FTA, to continue that exchange of experiences, to build understanding on both sides of the different conditions that bring about different approaches. For example, as you may well be aware, cattle in Australia tend to spend most of their lives on pasture rather than in barns or similar. So, it's not necessary for us to include requirements for a certain amount of time to be off concrete, for example, because our cattle tend to spend their time on grass for the vast majority of their lives, or on dust in the outback, depending on where they might be living. Anyway, so all that just to provide a bit of context that we have high standards, and we're really interested in continuing our cooperation with the EU as we develop our understanding, as the EU develops its understanding, as our scientists develop their understanding of ways in which we can continually improve our approach to animal welfare. And as I think, as Nicola mentioned, the Australian government, the new Australian government, not so new now, I think it's past the 12 months in office mark, but certainly our government has come in with a strong policy on animal welfare and a commitment to reviewing the strategy and approach at a national level, and that's something that's certainly will be happening in the very near future. And that reflects, I think, when we look back in the FTA context and bringing it back, as Nicholas mentioned, this animal welfare provisions that we've agreed do sit in the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems chapter, and we think that's appropriate because animal welfare is intrinsically linked to sustainable food systems, and it really recognises that increased productivity and resilience must be supported by good governance where countries behave ethically and lawfully. So the Australian government, and indeed Australian agricultural producers, take animal welfare seriously and hold true that animals should be treated humanely. So our animal welfare framework, is designed and is, appropriate to the systems that we have in place, which are quite different to the approach in the EU, which of course reflects the very different agricultural context that we have, whether that's the ecological, environmental context, the scale with which things happen on low fertility lands, etc. But the animal welfare system that we have in place is underpinned by a comprehensive legal framework, management across all Australian jurisdictions for the management, as Nicola touched on, perhaps not quite in the way I might have characterised some of it, but it does cover livestock, native species and domestic pets. And I think as Nicola did mention, all exports of of animal products from Australia must be produced to meet Australian animal welfare standards. So we are working with our states and territories. We are, as Nicola pointed out, a federal system of government, and they have certain areas under the Australian Constitution where the federal government has, as you would say in the EU, competency, and other areas that are under the competency of states and territories. But that's a very cooperative relationship, and under that, under those arrangements, we are working to phase out battery hens and to end live sheep exports by sea. In the meantime, you'll find that the consumer-led approach and the producer-led approach means that many producers and many consumers are ahead of the regulation, are ahead of where things are at. I think Nicola touched on the practice of mulesing, which is done to avoid fly strike, for example. Over 90% of sheep farmers who practice mulesing do so with pain relief, for example. And in fact, it's in the state of Victoria, that's a legal requirement. So, you know, while our approach can be more, tends to be more producer and consumer led, you'll find that the actual practices are very much in keeping. So given the importance of animal welfare to both Australia and the EU, we have agreed, as Nicholas said, to cooperate bilaterally, to cover that bilateral cooperation under the framework of the FTA, and we've identified through the text some potential areas for cooperation, including cooperating together in other international fora, in multilateral fora, for example, as well as exchanging information, expertise and experiences, and potentially cooperation on research, for example. We recognise that animal health and animal health science is being continuously updated, like all areas of science, continuously developing, and we are very much a government and a country committed to science and evidence-based policy approaches. And you'll see that we're very much have that at the heart of our approach to developing not only our policies on animal welfare, but really across the board. So look, I think I've covered a few different angles there, but I hope that's answered your question.
Many thanks, Emily. I'm just going to move on to the next questions for our other panelists. I'm just acutely aware that we only have about 15 minutes left in this discussion. So for the next answers, can we keep them as brief as possible? I'm not sure whether there's going to be other groups needing this room at 10 o'clock, so we might have a hard stop. Jad, question for you. The initial text proposal on animal welfare put forward by the Commission in 2018 was more or less restricted to providing a formalised framework for international and regulatory cooperation on animal welfare. It focuses mainly on the exchange of information expertise as well as cooperation on animal welfare research in a view to achieving regulatory alignment. Do you think this is actually enough? And do you think this trade deal presents an opportunity to raise farm animal welfare standards in Australia?
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. And noting the issue on timing, I've had a lot to say in response there to Emily, but I'll keep it very brief. Yes, this is an amazing opportunity for improving Australia's animal welfare standards. It is perfect timing as well with the change of government. We've got a government now that's a little bit more committed, I think, to managing national standards and leading states and territories. And this agreement and these negotiations certainly provide further impetus for that. I mean, it's disappointing that we need trade negotiations in order to make that a really important and relevant concern for the Australian government. But if that means we're going to see greater change, greater investment in animal welfare standards, then so be it. That's fantastic. Whether or not the current draft text goes far enough, obviously we would like to see it go further. Our main concern with it just being based on cooperation and the exchange of information is that that becomes quite vulnerable to the level of government commitment and priority of the day. So right now it may be good because, again, we've got a government that's interested in investing. If we have a change of government in the future, we might not see the same level of commitment and investment. And that's our concern, that the provisions don't go far enough. They're not strong enough to bind the Australian government to implementing these standards. The provision around regulatory alignment we thought was quite good. Whether or not we see that reflected in the final version, I don't know. The version that appeared in the UK Free Trade Agreement in terms of the exchange of information was simply to a view to promoting mutual understanding about each jurisdiction's arrangements rather than any kind of regulatory alignment. And we certainly understand the differences in climate and production systems, but we're concerned that that can often be used as an excuse by the Australian government not to move standards forward. Climate and production systems are no excuse for the fact that we still have battery cages in Australia. And while there's I guess, a proposal to phase them out by 2036. That still needs to be implemented legally in the various state and territory jurisdictions. So we still don't even have that currently in law in Australia. Climate and production systems, also, they're not an excuse not for mandating pain relief across the board throughout Australia and moving away from those painful, invasive husbandry practices. So acknowledge, again, that concern about differences, but it shouldn't be differences in outcomes. It's differences in how we get to the relevant outcome. So, yeah, we're waiting to see the final version of the text, but we certainly need to keep the Australian government honest.
Thank you very much. Could you just turn off the mic? Thank you. I've also just heard that we actually have the room till 10:30. So if we've overrun, if nobody else has any objections in the room to staying a little bit longer, we can actually go on a bit longer, which is good news for all those needing to answer questions. So Jed, you might want to add something later in a little bit to this. Steph. Both the animal agriculture industry and the NGOs have voiced a lot of concern about animal products produced under lower animal welfare standards being placed on the EU market. In trade terms, what do you think can be done to actually allay these fears? And how has this been dealt with in other trade deals that the EU has concluded with other countries?
That's a very good question. I'm going to be mindful not to repeat what's been said, still cautious with the time. I think it's very good to start because you started speaking about EU producers and allaying their fears. It's really not about protectionism. Ensuring that trade policy does not harm animal welfare is, to us at least, and I feel also in trade terms, not something that is to do with protectionism. It's about making sure for EU consumers that they're not fueling a practice that they would want to ban here in the EU. And then by not doing anything about imports, then probably they're fueling that practice somewhere else. So first, it's all about ethics. It's about making sure that all products on the EU market respect similar rules, regardless of where they come from. It has nothing to do with anywhere else. And it's not something that's important only for Europeans. I think we only have an old survey from 2016, but it still says that I think more than 90%, 93% of the EU citizens would want to see the same rules applied to imports and, to EU products. My guess is that they just don't know. It's not the case at the moment, but it's still important to say that. And I think a recent study, Jed, correct me if I'm wrong, in Australia also said that more than 90%, 91% of Australians want to see better farm animal welfare. So it's also a very important concern in Australia. So that's where we start from. In terms of solutions, as was said, not everything can be done through cooperation, and trade agreements at the moment have been mostly about this. It's a different pipeline, but of course, as you mentioned, Joe, import requirements that could be contained in the proposal of the new legislation are key to us. It's really, this revision is really a process for which we welcome the Commission and we really support their efforts. We know it's a hard road, it's a difficult road, but we are all with you until the autumn. I think it's really something that we need to look into. If there's one concern for which we can say that there's support in terms of EU citizens, probably animal welfare. When you look at European citizen initiatives, you mentioned the cages, we can mention the one on fur recently, and others also on shark finning, on animals in science. We can say there's huge support. And I think if something can pass the World Trade Organization rules, it's probably that based, as you know, we can restrict trade based on ethical concerns if it's fair, if it's well built as a measure. So I really believe we can do this because it's based on a genuine concern. Yes, it has a side effect. It's also good in terms of level playing field, but it's really not only about that. So in terms of course, what can we do? More import requirements, but that you all know. But to come back to FTAs, to free trade agreements, it's good to also look at what the sustainability impact assessment on EU Australia agreement was saying back then. Any scenario would be bad in terms of the impact that the ruminant meat industry in Australia would have, because any scenario would probably increase the export, the production of beef and of
sheep meat as well in Australia. And this industry has an impact on soil, on water. So it's good to keep that in mind. And even the CIA from the EU was saying that the TSD provisions at the moment could not really counterbalance this. So they were also recommending to look at market access. And what we, of course, hope to see is something a bit similar than in the New Zealand agreement. So conditions in the market access offer. As you know, the beef, in order to be granted preferential tariffs, it has to come from pasture and not from feedlots. In Australia, I think 96% of the meat we import from Australia, from the beef meat, comes from feedlots. So it would be amazing to have such condition, which was also based on sustainability reasons in New Zealand. So there's no reason not to have it with Australia. And as we know from our Australian colleagues, also from the mission, they're happy to just, you know, do the method that is preferred by the client. So let's tell them we want pasture-based. It's much better for us. So that is something we should have. The Mercosur agreement, it's still a draft, but there was a condition, for instance, on shell eggs. Also, it had to follow similar standards as in the EU, which is good because if the EU legislation evolve, it could also evolve. So that's also something we could look at for other products with Australia. And of course, on certain topics that are not regulated in the EU, we talked about mulesing, super important here, but we're not mulesing animals here in the EU. We will never have rules about this. And there's no tariff on wool, so you can't really play with tariffs in order to do something. So this is something you have to use cooperation for. You have to maybe at some point say that you might take an autonomous measure about it, but you know, you have to also use cooperation to make sure that Australia moves away from this. And this is for us like the sort of triptych of solutions. Of course, autonomous measures are very important. And then you can have ambitious cooperation. As Jet said, it's important to also look at the cooperation that delivers something and not only exchange views to better understand what the other is doing. Let's also have better objectives. If we want to all move cage-free, let's move together, for instance. And yeah, market access conditions.
Many thanks, Steph, for that. Before I move on to the wildlife side, would any other members of the panel like to respond very briefly to what has been said? Maybe our colleagues from the Commission or Jet.
I give the start, maybe, and then. Oh no, yeah, that was the yeah. Yes, thank you for your points that you raised. Indeed, in New Zealand, there are the reference that you said and that are very present to the negotiators as a background, and with reference to the importance of applying EU environmental standards to the imported product. Again, in response to a request of the European Parliament in last year, I think, the Commission produced a report on that, expanding on the importance of applying health and environmental standards to imported products and reflecting on the importance of the Sustainable Development chapter of the SFS, of the SPS measures in order to achieve these points. So these your stance are known, requests are known to the European Commission and to the negotiators that are ongoing, and we thank you for your points.
Thank you, Flavia. Emily, you'd also like to give a brief input.
I would, thanks. I just want to pick up that point about grass-fed versus feedlots. Look, around 50% of cattle in Australia spend their entire life grass-fed, and then those that are finished through feedlots, that other 50% generally only spend a short period of time in feedlots. But the point I want to just make here is that those feedlots are very much like the barn systems that you have in the EU, as I understand. So we're not talking about something that is a departure from EU approaches by any stretch. In fact, in general, the cattle in Australia will spend a lot less time in those housed conditions than what the average cattle would in the EU. So it can be a bit simplistic to take that kind of line and to say, well, it has to be grass-fed. If that's the case, then we'd have to take a different approach, presumably, to agricultural production in the EU, which is of course limited by your own production circumstances. So, but I just want to I'm going to have to pass the baton to my colleague, Joe Granger. I thought we were finishing, and unfortunately, while you have the room available, I'm solo parenting and have children that I really need to pick up because it's dark here already. So I will have to go. So I'm going to, as we say in Australia, I'm going to handball over to Joe. So thank you very much for having me join, and thank you, Joe, for picking up on that point and taking the discussion forward. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you for longer.
Many thanks, Emily. It was a bit of a puzzle to actually get the right time to hold this event. For us, it meant getting up at stupid o'clock. For you guys, it's the end of the day. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, please, the other Joe, if you want to join us on camera now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can thank you, Emily, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me join this useful conversation today. Look, I just wanted to add a few points to the ones that Emily has made this morning. Look, I think it's really important to highlight that Australian agricultural producers, particularly those who farm animals, are very committed to health and welfare. In fact, full lifetime animal health and welfare. So all of our major agricultural commodity industries have sustainability frameworks. And one of the key priorities of all of those frameworks is the full-time animal health and welfare priority. And of course, those industries are supported by rural research and development corporations. These are corporations where our farmers pay levies and the Australian government matches that money, and it goes to on-farm productivity gains, but a portion of those funds always goes to animal health and welfare and the extension. And so we are constantly updating the science and spending money on the extension to allow farmers to actually understand how best they can look after their animals and take those new practices on board. So I think something to really highlight there, that we have a Australian government committed, and as panelists have already noted, we have a new government with a very strong commitment to animal welfare. In fact, my new minister made it one of the priority mentions in his recent budget speech to the agriculture industry. And then of course we have industry behind that, with sustainability frameworks and a very strong commitment on paper, on measurement, in dollars being spent on actually improving health and welfare. The other element I just want to raise quickly is there's been a point made about clearing of land and the question of deforestation. I'm pleased to advise that we are a deforestation-free provider, and so the clearing of land that Nicola was talking to earlier today, that is the clearing of woody weeds and regrowth. Often forest clearing or clearing that is being done on farms is not the forest that Europeans think of when they think of deforestation. We don't clear timber forests in rainforests to graze animals. We're a big country. We're grazing animals on pasture, on much broader systems. And the reason we have large farms is because we have a very low carrying capacity of our land. So that clearing that's being done, it's often re-clearing of previously cleared. It's about clearing the landscape of weeds and pests, helping maintain that. And the other important factor is that actually those structures of woody weeds, they're not necessarily a great carbon sink. You can actually improve your carbon management if you do regular re-clearing. I'd just like to point to a couple of facts. So FAO, obviously the UN body, it ranks Australia second globally for increased forest area. Our forest area has actually been growing over the last 10 years, and we have very strong forest management. So clearing, particularly of woody weed and scrub in relation to cattle, is quite a different thing to the deforestation that I think EU consumers have been debating. I think that's about it. Oh, the other thing I'd just like to highlight really quickly is I know there was a reference earlier to the sustainability impact assessment and this concern about increasing the production of beef and sheep. As I just mentioned, the reality is Australia, we have old dry soils, we have very low intensity production because we are ravaged by drought. And so the reality is our herd is fairly fixed. We don't have a huge capacity. We don't have the beautiful soil and the wonderful rain that the EU climate is like. We just don't have that. And so the carrying capacity of our land is quite fixed. So while, of course, our herd does fluctuate, there's really no capacity in Australia to somehow hugely increase our production of beef and sheep. If anything, over time, it's pretty standard. And so at the moment, Australian agricultural production, we say, is about 1% of global ag production. The latest figures, we're actually 0.56%. We're a large landmass, 70% of it is desert. And so we really do have quite constrained agricultural production and quite a small producer on the world stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe. I think Jed is kind of itching to respond to this, but he, please, really short because we only have, well, 10 more minutes at most.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I just wanted to address really briefly one element of Joe's remarks there, and then I think Nicola wanted to address the forest clearing issue. But I think that was quite reflective and symptomatic of one of the major problems that we have in Australia, which is the constant deference to the livestock industries themselves to be setting their own standards, marking their own homework. We have a system in Australia where we don't have independent governance of animal welfare. We don't have the equivalent of the EFSA Animal Health and Welfare Panel. Standards are produced in a very ad hoc manner, and it gives the livestock industries and other animal industry bodies an enormous amount of influence and control over that process. So if the livestock industries do not wish to see change in certain areas, they don't get change. That the government will often bend to what their concerns are. The sustainability frameworks that they have set extremely modest targets for improving animal welfare, and they're also quite vague, and they address very focused, very specific elements of their production systems. So this is why we need independent governance of animal welfare in Australia, so that we can actually have more robust benchmarks for checking the way Australia is performing. So just wanted to put that plug in there.
Yes, I'd just like to respond on the, is my microphone on?
Yeah, turn on the next one.
That one? I'll turn that one off, thanks. I'd like to respond on the deforestation point that Joe was making. I've rarely heard a defence of Australia's habitat clearing rates. I think it's inarguable. Deforestation is a serious problem in Australia. Land clearing, vegetation clearing is recognised as a key threatening process to Australia's threatened species under our national environment laws. It is native habitat that is being cleared. I think it's a mischaracterisation to call it weeds. We're talking about native vegetation that is being cleared here. Sometimes that might be regrowth vegetation, but nevertheless, it is important habitat for wildlife. And it is the key threat to the koala, which is a much beloved Australian species, recently upgraded to endangered, principally because of vegetation clearing, and a significant proportion of that clearing is for the beef industry in Queensland. So I was quite surprised by Joe's defence of our vegetation clearing rates, because they are really a very serious issue for Australia to deal with.
Thank you, Nicola. I mean, I think this makes a nice segue into the last remaining section, which we don't really have much time for, unfortunately, is relating to wildlife protection and the Sustainable Development chapter. Both the EU and Australia have taken leadership role internationally when it comes to sustainable development issues through progressive policies taken in recent trade agreements. We don't actually have anybody working on the Sustainable Development chapter here today from the Commission, but we do from the Australian side. We know that the existing 2008 EU-Australia Partnership Framework already commits to a cooperation on biodiversity conservation, including the protection of endangered species, well conservation, and the creation of marine protected areas on the high seas. For those that are still here, how do you think that the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter in the trade deal under negotiation could expand on this partnership agreement and deliver even more commitments to protecting wildlife species and their natural habitats? I mean, if you looked at CPTPP. Australia, in that agreement with other Pacific nations, Australia agreed to protections targeted at specific marine species like sharks, turtles, marine mammals. But the EU has never actually done this so far in its FTAs. Is this something, I know that chapter is still probably where the negotiators are still kind of, battling it out right now in Australia. But is this something that we could maybe expect from the trade deal? And, can anybody actually share anything with us as regards to wildlife protection? In the negotiations so far. I don't know, Flavia, you can say anything really, really minimal on this. I know it's not your area.
Thank you, Jo. As I said, I worked in the SPS chapter, not on the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter for the day. My colleague gave me a very few lines, which I will report on that, and then maybe the Australian counterpart will be more knowledgeable and be willing to build on that. So I understand that there is a special consideration in the text being discussed with Australia on trade and wildlife conservation, and that in the dialogue with Australia we have a special dedicated article on that, which is a positive development compared to other drafts that we have seen in other trade agreements, and that there are essentially three key commitments: combating illegal wildlife trade and conservation of endangered species and cooperation in bilateral international fora, and that our guiding star are always the international agreements on the matter. So that I understand is a positive development compared to previous draft, and a commitment from both sides to show that we are engaged, that we are like-minded, that we want to work on the item, and that we care about boosting that further. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flavia. Jo, really quickly, because I have one more question for the panel. So if you can give any insights onto this very briefly, it'd be appreciated.
Indeed. Look, I too, I'm afraid I was on the SBS chapter. I was not involved in TSD. What I can tell you is our Trade Minister has instructed the negotiation team that he wants this to be the most sustainable free trade agreement Australia has ever committed to. And I understand that the TSD chapter is still under negotiation, but a very clear direction from government to be committed to sustainability. And in fact, I think very similar to potentially where the New Zealand deal aligned. We just have to reflect it into the Australian government system, because of course, as has been mentioned earlier today, we have a federal system of constitution. So some things sit with the federal government, some things sit with the state. So really looking to make the sustainability chapter meet there. In terms of CITES itself, I agree with Flavia's points, but I would recognise that Australia and the EU are long-term members of CITES. We're very committed to it. And at the recent COP that was held in Panama City in November 2022, Australia worked hard to put a range of extra species on the list. And we thank the EU for the support at that time. So I think our long-standing commitment, support and participation in CITES, and our strong domestic regulation to try and reduce, to look after our wildlife and to address wildlife trafficking stands us in good stead for some further continued very good cooperation on this topic.
Many thanks, Jo. I'm now going to move to the very final question, which I think I'll direct at both Steph and Nicola. Do you think that the EU-Australia trade deal should, for example, include strong commitments requiring each party to protect its own domestic wildlife and wildlife habitats? In particular, I'm thinking what Nicola had said in her presentation about the use of shark nets and drumlines and and how this is failing to protect other marine species who fall victim to them, like the 6 turtles a month that are being killed by nets. And maybe there are other issues that you'd like to raise with regard to marine or terrestrial wildlife in, let's say, you've got 2 minutes each.
Excellent. I'm going to be short because I'm going to get killed by my colleagues if I don't mention certain things. No, I'm joking. It's been mentioned by Nicola, of course. As you might imagine, usually it's in Sustainable Development chapter, they look more at the conservation angle, and being an animal protection organization, we would love also the partners to look also into the welfare of wild animals, because for us, it also matters a lot at the individual level, I mean. And so I think that already one of the important things is that it's hard to assess the impact of trade policy on biodiversity, and the Commission has established a new methodology. I think it's going to be used to assess the impact of CETA, probably now at the moment. So it would be interesting to look at what are the results, and to also, draw lessons from that. That will be interesting also in terms of designing provisions for the future trade agreements. And then, of course, the topic I would love to mention is the kangaroo hunting. It's been mentioned by Nicola. This is something that we really care a lot about, because we don't have kangaroos in the EU, so we can't teach you how to kill them or how to manage them. It's not the process, but technically speaking, in the EU, citizens are shocked by these hunting practices. It happens at night. 40% of the animals are shot in the neck. There's a lot of suffering. It just doesn't happen like seals on a very nice, white snow. So it's beautiful, like photogenic, whatever you say this in English. But for us, it's really terrible. It's very hard to differentiate a young male from a female. So very often you have joeys that are either left to die or that are simply, killed by being bludgeoned on a car. And it's actually the rules. It's mandated to be like this. So for us, this is really something that we would want to see stop. We can't say anything to Australia, but we want to stop the imports of kangaroo-derived products in the EU. So not only the food that goes often into pet food in the EU, or into collective restoration or restaurants, kangaroo meat. And then also the leather in a lot of cases they can be. So this is something that only cooperation can be used for, the threat of something bigger, and making sure that this improves. So this is technically something we would love to see discussed. But also I think the EU and Australia can learn a lot from each other in terms of discussing how to protect wild animals, also by regulating the trade in exotic pets. As you know, in the EU, we are trying maybe to move forward to a positive list of animals that can be traded as pets, and that also is for the welfare of the animals themselves. So many animals can't be kept at home, but also it has an impact on conservation, because for many animals that are taken from the wild, a lot are just killed in the process, and yeah, it's terrible as well. So those are very concrete files on which I think it would be nice to see a mention in the FTA. Won't happen, but it's good for the cooperation process that it's on the table.
It's always good to have aspirations. Nicola, I'm going to give the last word for the panel to you.
Thank you. I feel honoured to get the last word. Yes, look, I think it's really important that the free trade agreement focuses on animal welfare standards for the animals who are involved directly in production of the commodities that are being traded, because we know that the free trade agreement is intended to lift productivity. So it's really important that those standards are strong for those animals. But then when it comes to your question about the agreement extolling both sides to protect their own wildlife more effectively in country, I mean, that is also really important, because a lot of the impacts of trade are externalized, and the impacts on the environment. And I think if we just have stronger environmental protection generally, that creates a better, more sustainable context for sustainable development and trade between our countries. So while the shark nets might not be so relevant for trade, they are relevant for EU tourists when they visit Australia, but they're not relevant for trade. But it is important in terms of both sides of the agreement, just looking after our own environments better. And then I'd just like to reflect again on a point that was made earlier. Australia's wildlife, our flora and fauna, very weird and wonderful, and unfortunately highly collectible, and particularly prized in the European pet trade. So if I could make a plug again for the EU to work closely with Australia in terms of closing those loopholes that see Australian wildlife, which is very heavily and seriously protected in Australia, to make sure that the EU is not providing a market for it for illegally trafficked wildlife to be making its way into the European pet trade. That would be a wonderful outcome from this agreement.
Many thanks, Nicola, and that's certainly a sentiment that Humane Society International would also echo. I'm going to have to close this meeting. It's a shame that there's not enough time to field some questions from the floor, but I'm sure if there's any kind of urgent question that you'd like to ask our panelists, please do get in touch and I can pass them on to either the negotiators from the Australian side, from the EU side, or to our NGO representatives. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us, either here in the room or online, wherever you may be. I wish those in Europe a good rest of the day and a very good evening to all those in Australia. Thank you so much, Joe, and also to your colleague Emily for participating online. We greatly appreciate that, and apologies in advance for the gremlins at the start. We'll be able to provide you with the full PowerPoint and the notes from the speaking notes. So, you'll be able to at least know what we were actually saying in addition to the slides. Okay, thank you very much. On that note, I will declare this meeting closed. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening.